I get us started. It's 12:45 here in the UK. I want to welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining from. I just want to give you a warm welcome, both to those joining online and those who are joining us here in Oxford. Welcome to the Blavatnik School of Government. It is an honor and a privilege to be able to welcome people in person. Last year, we had a conference online. And this year, we embrace in this adventure of hosting a hybrid conference. We had registration from 1,400 people. So it's a great success. And we couldn't host 1,400 people in Oxford. So this hybrid conference is a great opportunity to reach out to many of you interested in improving social outcomes. I am Mara Roldi. I'm the academic director of the Government Outcomes Lab. We are a research center based here in Oxford, the Blavatnik School of Government, and we really work with practitioners and with researchers to try to improve how government works to tackle complex social issues. At the school, we have an ambition really to improve government across the world. We do so in teaching. We have an MPP program, we have executive education, and we have tailored senior leaders education. The Executive Public Leader Program is one of our spotlight events. We do engagement, and we do various types of events like the event that we have today. We were established in 2016 as a partnership with the UK government. And the particular topic, the things that moves us and keeps us passionate is looking at how government can unlock cross-sector partnership to tackle complex social issues, where government alone can't do it, the private sector alone can't do it, the non-for-profit, the civil society can't do it alone. How do you bring these different players together and coordinate action to tackle pressing social issues? We have an online community that is very active. We bring together stakeholders from various walks of life. We have a great data collaborative that standardizes information on projects. In particular, IMPA Bonds is the largest database that we have. We have a database on outcome fund and organization working in this sector. We have research that we publish regularly. We have published recently a paper on a contractual issue when you have incomplete information. Is 2021, so is our 5th year birthday. And we recently published taking stock of what we've been doing to date. If you want to learn more about the activities and the people that we bring around the table, have a look at this a report that spotlights some of the work that we've been doing. But enough about us at the Go Lab. Let's talk about the conference. We lined up a stellar panel of speakers and many sessions that will run in parallel. The program is all online. The conference will be open in a few minutes. With an introduction by our Dean and Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who is twice Nobel laureate, and it will provoke us in thinking how the work that we do links with big ideas on what should we measure to really drive the movement towards a society that is the society we want to live in. We have 2 big picture sessions, roundtable discussion, and 9 deep dive that will run in parallel. For anything about the program, please go online, save this link. It will be your orientation throughout these 2 days together. So you will have direct link on how to join every session. For those who are here, everything is signposted. And please try to engage both with the people who are here with us today and those who are online by joining the Zoom. As I said, if you join on the Zoom chat as well as in person, keep yourself muted so that we don't hear an echo. I just want to say a couple of words about who are our speakers. We have 5 parallel themes that we are covering in this conference. Outcome-based contracting is one of our main themes, but also outcome orientation in general. We look at government, business, and civil society and how they can operate successfully in a place. We look at measuring outcomes and value for money. And we have speakers from various walks of life and participants from various walks of life. 25 countries represented, 115 speakers. About 50% are academia and think tanks, and the other 50% are from the world of practice, the non-for-profit, government, and the private sector. I would like to invite you to tell us something about you right now. And so please humor us with joining us on Slido. If you have a mobile phone, you can just scan the QR code, or you can just type slido.com. The access to this particular survey is hashtag SOC21. And there will be a few questions there. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to find out something about who is joining us. Okay, we have a big contingent from Oxford. We have people from the Philippines, Singapore, Italy. Ciao, I'm Italian too. The Netherlands, France, Brazil, Geneva, Switzerland, the USA, Spain. In organizing the conference, we've been very, very mindful to pick times like the keynote where we could welcome people from all over the world, but there are people joining us in the middle of the night, like Rodney. And so I'm very grateful for you to making the time despite your time zones. So this is the organization. Many people from the University of Oxford, various university, Independent Instiglio, Pathfinders, Social Finance, the World Bank, Traverse. So we have 38% of people who are the aficionados that are returning, and we are welcoming about 63%. So welcome to this community, and I think we hope we will give you enough space to contribute your ideas, and you will keep finding what we offer of help. I can see we have many questions for the conference. On the poll, you will be able to scroll through them. People are looking at social measurement, meeting real people. So this comes from somebody who is here. New thoughts, meeting, interacting, sharing ideas. We will do all of those. Those are easy. I expected difficult questions. We can meet those. Before I hand over to our dean to welcome Professor Stiglitz, I just want to point to the people who are able to help you if you need directions. So I just want to thank Andrea, who is here in the front, Tanya, Harry, can you give a wave for people in the room? Nigel, we have Mayra at the back, and L. If you need direction during the conference, they are GoLabers. Please ask for help, any issue you might have. And for those online, you will find their name, surname, and GoLab. If you have any issue or you have any questions, technological problems, you want to make recommendation, feel free to reach out to any GoLaber online, and they will be there to help and assist you. So without further ado, Nari, I'll hand over to you to welcome our keynote speaker.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, look, good afternoon and good morning to folks who are on the other side of the Atlantic, and good day to those in other parts of the world. You are all embodiments of something we're trying so hard to do in everything we do here at the Blavatnik School of Government, which is starting from, I think something all of us agree with, getting government right is hard. So one of the most important things we can do is learn to learn, and learn to learn much faster and more effectively from other countries. And we have many different countries here, from other sectors, so that the public, private, not-for-profit, academic sectors can really learn from each other effectively. And of course, from other disciplines, to get out of our disciplinary silos and focus on particular problems. And it has been fantastic to watch the progress made by the Government Outcomes Lab in these first 5 years of its existence, really focusing not just on how outcomes-based commissioning might work, but how partnerships that undergird it would work. What is it and how is it that we can make partnerships between communities and government and the private sector and social entrepreneurs and others work most effectively to deliver social outcomes? Of course, that poses the question, whose social outcomes, defined by who, held accountable by who, and measured how? And that brings me to our keynote speaker. I don't know if Joe has joined us yet. Has Joe joined us? Yes. I haven't yet seen him on screen. Well, Joe, a huge welcome back to Oxford and to the Blavatnik School of Government. It is a pleasure to have you with us. Joe Stiglitz needs little introduction. He's one of the most feted economists of our time, the Bates Medal, the Nobel Prizes. He was Drummond Professor here at Oxford in the late 1970s, which was far too short a tenure, Joe. He served in the Clinton administration as chair of economic advisors. He served as chief economist of the World Bank. But what I want to highlight to you is that across all of that public service and academic work, Joe has been absolutely rare in his humility and his determination to listen to those who are at the sharpest end of policies. In 2000, Joe rather controversially said, he was speaking of the IMF, but I want you not to focus on the IMF, but to think about your own work and the organizations that you work with. Because he accused that organization of being arrogant, of not listening to those who it most affected, and for being insulated from democratic accountability. And I think we can all think about the ways in which our own work might suffer from these things. But in introducing Joe Stiglitz and the incredible work he's done on thinking about economic performance and social progress, I do want to just highlight that one of the things that Joe has just steadfastly stood up for at every turn is the democratic accountability, the listening to those on the other side, to listening to those who are most affected. Joe, it is such an honor and a pleasure to have you in the school. Welcome. I can't wait to hear what you've got to say.
Well, thank you very much. And I really would have preferred to have been there in Oxford. The subject that was given to me was measuring what counts in order to make markets work for people. But I would have preferred, and what I'm going to talk about, a slightly different title, which is measuring what counts in order to make society, our institutions, work for people. The distinction that I'm making is that markets are only one instrument, and a very limited instrument, for achieving social objectives. Markets have some very important limitations. They're typically driven by, you might call it the bottom line. The bottom line is money. And even though some corporations have tried to go beyond financial returns to broader concepts, ESG, the fact is that they are still singularly focused on finance, on money. The point I'm trying to make is actually there are a much richer, much wider range of social institutions. And one of our challenges is actually to design institutions that work. Markets are one category of institutions, but there are many others, and I'll give some illustrations later. That links with another broader theme in my work and work I've been advocating is there needs to be a broader set of objectives. And understanding the objectives of policy in general, social policy institutions, is absolutely necessary if we're going to evaluate the success of what we do. And an essential part of any institution are the governing structures, the parts, the ways in which institutions evaluate themselves and are evaluated by others. So let me give you an example of what I have in mind and that illustrates some of the general principles that I'm trying to get at. One of the important development institutions, which I was involved in the 1990s and in the years since, was microfinance, getting out money, small amounts of money, to poor people, and getting it out to people without power, to women in rural areas. And this was an idea that was developed by Muhammad Yunus, who got a Nobel Prize for his work, by BRAC, by several large NGO institutions in Bangladesh. In setting up these institutions, the objective was not, as surprising as it might seem, to give them money. Giving them money was one aspect of a broader set of objectives. That broader set of objectives was the empowerment of women, changing the nature of Bangladeshi society. At one point, a lot of concern in the design of the program to end the power relationship between men and women that prevailed under Muslim law, where a husband could just say, "I divorced thee 3 times," by giving stronger property rights to women. The way you would evaluate, the way Yunus would have evaluated microfinance is not whether the loans went out and got repaid. It was true that they were repaid. And many people looking at microfinance were amazed at the repayment rates, well over 90%, greater than the repayment rates that were made to richer people. And that was part of the success of microfinance. But in terms of evaluating the success of microfinance, money was a small part. It was the change in society that Eunice wanted to bring about through microfinance? Well, unfortunately, a lot of people focused on the finance part of it. And there were a lot of evaluations, RTCs on microfinance, trying to fine-tune the microfinance to increase the repayment rates and so forth. And the idea got a lot of attention, and the idea spread, became a global movement. And it spread in particular to India, much larger economy. But when it spread to India, it spread, the amount of money went up, the lending went up, you might say, in terms of metrics based on performance of money distributed. It was a success. But in terms of the social agenda, it was a miserable failure. As it went to India, it was taken up by the private sector. The private sector's objectives were much more narrow than the broader objectives that Eunice had in mind as he developed the whole microcredit regime. And so the ability of microcredit to transform society, as it had done in Bangladesh, leading to not only women's empowerment, more education, increase in life expectancy, many dimensions, those achievements did not occur in India. In fact, what happened in India was what Reddy, who was the head of the central bank, the Reserve Bank of India, described was India's subprime mortgage market. It was equivalent of how American mortgage market managed to exploit poor Americans. And microcredit gave a new tool to the financial markets in India to exploit poor Indians. The result was the biggest bankruptcy of any microcredit. Antara Halder and I have written a couple of papers evaluating the success in Bangladesh and the failure in India, and calling attention in particular to how the shift from the not-for-profit, the NGO model that was used in Bangladesh, to the for-profit model that was used in India was a very deep change in the fundamental structure of the program, and that the result of that movement from not-for-profit to for-profit almost doomed the microcredit experiment in India to a failure. So the reason I'm emphasizing this is that there are many objectives as we think about any institutional innovation, any government intervention. And we want our evaluation to be comprehensive and include the many aspects of that. And that's really difficult. And I'll come back to that as I go along. But what I also wanted to emphasize is the design of the institutions has fundamental effects on how the institutions behave. It is very hard to get for-profit institutions to behave in ways that are identical to not-for-profits. And I'm oversimplifying by categorizing things between for-profits and not-for-profits. Another important set of institutions in the financial area are co-ops. A particular form of co-ops in the United States are called credit unions. And there is a wide swath of evidence that fundamentally credit unions, cooperatives, behave differently than for-profit financial institutions. And it's just very difficult to get for-profit financial institutions to behave in the same way. During the run-up to the crisis of 2018, the credit unions, not surprisingly, did not engage in the same kind of predatory behavior. They did not engage in the same kind of discriminatory behavior that all of our major banks engaged in. And after the crisis of 2008, the credit unions continued to provide money to their members to support small businesses, to create jobs, whereas the big financial institutions effectively exited that market and constrained their lending. So in evaluating lending, you want to be very sensitive to the broad range of activities and the deep, you almost say, the DNA that affects the behavior of those institutions. Well, to come back to the broad topic of my talk, which is measuring what counts. In 2008, before the financial crisis, President Sarkozy of France asked me to chair a commission, which we called the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. After the commission made its report, and I think it had had a greater impact than we had expected, that initiative was taken up by the OECD and has continued there. And we had a report then in 2018 and 19, a couple of reports, and I'll reflect a little bit later on those later reports. But I want to mention now the two motivations of President Sarkozy in creating the report, and I think they're related to some of the themes of this conference. The first was, as a politician, he knew he was going to be partly graded by how well France did in terms of GDP. When people look at how a government does, that's part of what of how citizens evaluate the country. But he was also smart enough to know that that was not what people cared about. They didn't want just an increase in GDP. They were cared about pollution. They cared about air pollution, noise pollution. They cared about many other things that were going on in society. And so he said, I'm getting conflicting messages. People want me to increase GDP, but some of the things that I do to increase GDP will actually lower their welfare. So there was more, people care about more than GDP. We had to go beyond GDP. And he wanted us to come up with some way of providing guidance that went beyond GDP, that would incorporate things that people really cared about. And there was another aspect of his concern, and that was that, especially in our world of enormous inequality, GDP could be going up, and yet most people could be experiencing a lowering of their standard of living. And he was concerned that that disjunction between what people experience, things getting worse, and the allegation that the statement that the economy was doing better, that GDP was going up, undermined trust in society. People were worried. He was worried that people would say, if I say the GDP is going up, and most people feel something's going down, they think either the government is manipulating the data or something else is going on the system is rigged. And that would undermine trust. Absolutely right. And we saw evidence of that kind of problem in the years after the 2008 crisis. A striking thing about the 3 years after the crisis that affected American politics enormously was that in those 3 years, 2009 to 2012, President Obama was championing the economic recovery. He was saying the economy was doing well. And in terms of GDP, it was doing well, sort of. Could have been doing better. But 91% of all the gains were going to the top 1%. So the bottom 99% of Americans did not see the economy as doing better. So they either came to the conclusion as the government was lying about the statistics, or the system was rigged in ways that when it did better, it didn't affect them. They didn't benefit. And so that undermined trust in government. A major theme of our, two major themes of our study was, the first was, what you measure affects what you do. And that's especially true in our performance-based society. And that means if you measure the wrong thing, you'll do the wrong thing. And if you have too narrow a set of metrics, it will guide you to focus too narrowly on what you're supposed to be doing. Getting a good measure is difficult. And one of the reasons that many privatizations have failed is that when we've contracted out for certain privatizations, our measures have not been adequately comprehensive. Say, I began with the microfinance as a good example. Anybody that focused in microfinance on money is missing the whole point of why microfinance was introduced. It was about societal transformation. And evaluating societal transformation is really difficult. An example of the area where privatization has been a dismal failure is the privatizing of prisons. You can talk about you developed a narrow set of metrics. Cost is what private sector tends to focus on, but you can minimize cost by feeding people in prison worse and worse food, not providing them with an education that enables them to re-enter the labor force. And what you want to really be concerned with is some long-term sense of how you are able to enable them to re-enter society and how successful they will be. But developing good metrics, long-term metrics, evaluating whether prisons are successful in doing that has eluded those who've tried to privatize prisons. And the result of that is privatized prisons have been notably a failure. One aspect that hard to bring into standard economic analysis is that once you privatize prisons, you give rise to a political dynamic. The political dynamic is that the prison companies want to have more people in prison. And so they begin to lobby for tougher laws that put more people in prison. So rather than having a system that tries to keep people out of prison and give them opportunity, you have a strong political lobby that wants to put more and more people in prison and keep them there and get them back over and over again. So there's a fundamental conflict between social objectives and private objectives. And it's virtually impossible to design contracting arrangements that resolve this conflict between social concerns and private concerns. So that's one fundamental problem, and I'll come back to that over and over again because it is a fundamental problem in the design of contracts that try to devolve public responsibility to the private sector. The second major problem is that has to do with summarizing a complex set of objectives in a few numbers. That goes back to GDP. The reason GDP was an attractive number, was that it's a single number that we could grade how well we're doing. But you can't evaluate anything as complex as our society in a single number. And that's why one of the important recommendations of our commission was that there should be a dashboard. Shouldn't add up things as different as how we're doing in addressing the health of our people, in addressing environmental sustainability, inequality, and the development of the market, all in a single number. It's sort of analogous to saying if you were driving a car, there are two numbers that are really important: how far you can go before you run out of gas and how fast you're going. Nobody would say that you could add those two numbers up in any way without losing all the relevant information. So you need a dashboard. And here you have the fundamental conflict. You want a small enough dashboard to focus your attention, but a large enough dashboard to identify the major salient activities. And figuring out that dashboard, it's essential to have a broad democratic process to figure out what are the things that society, the people, that the institution really cares about. And so the construction of the dashboard is absolutely essential. Now, one of the problems in devising performance contracting, and I'll say a little bit about more later, is that you have to add these up together with weights. But one of our conclusions was that that was foolish. Different people may, at the level of the society, have different weights. And that's been sort of the strength of the OECD Better Living Standards approach. They let each citizen make his own judgment about the weights associated with different elements of the dashboard. Well, I've emphasized over and over again how difficult it is to develop metrics, that there isn't a single metric that will suffice, but we can't escape the need to evaluate and measure. And so I want to spend a few minutes talking about how we go about doing that. And here there are two essential questions. What are the objectives of the institution, of our program? And having identified the objectives, how do we formulate metrics? When we went to talk about our societal objectives, our commission working at a very high level, macroeconomic level, we began with a discussion about what do we care about, what promotes well-being, engaged in extensive discussion around the world. And we identified in our early report a number of things that were left out or not adequately treated by GDP, concerns about inequality, sustainability in all its dimensions, environmental sustainability, political sustainability, social and economic sustainability. Many countries might have good GDP, but it's not sustainable in any of those senses. We also talked about health and not captured well by GDP. The United States has a very high GDP per capita, but a lot of it is repairing the damage that the private sector does. The private sector sells food that leads to childhood diabetes, engages in lots of other things that undermine health. And then we have to spend a lot of money on health to repair the damage that the private sector does. These are called broadly defensive expenditures, and they don't add to well-being. That began a longer discourse that we took up in our subsequent panel at the OECD, where other factors that went into well-being were talked about. For instance, security. People really do worry about insecurity, trust, and other aspects of social interaction. The consequences of the lack of trust are so manifest right now in the midst of the pandemic in the United States. The lack of respect for others, leading in some parts of the United States, people refusing to wear masks, leading in turn to the spread of the disease. So highlighting the interactions between various elements in the dashboard that we've created. In our analysis, we also focused both on objective metrics and subjective measures. Objective metrics are things like in terms of security, the probability that somebody falls into poverty or faces food insecurity. Subjective measures are people's perceptions of their well-being. And economists had long been skeptical of subjective measures, but one of our aspects of our analysis was to show that, in fact, subjective measures are replicable. They have you might say, objective reality to these subjective measures, and our report helped push the development of those subjective measures. Of course, there should be some connections between the subjective and the objective measures, and that's an important area of research and linking the two, and a way of confirming that we are, if our objective measures don't get reflected in subjective well-being, we should be concerned. And if there is not a correspondence between the subjective and our objective, we should be concerned. So it is absolutely essential in the beginning of any exercise, like trying to evaluate macro or performance of a society, or micro, the performance of a policy or a project, or we need to be clear about the objectives. And we ought to be clear that in many cases there are a multiplicity of objectives, with different people not necessarily agreeing on the weights of those different objectives. As I say, microcredit that I began this talk with is a real good example. It was not about finance. It was about social transformation. And anybody who used metrics focused on finance was missing the whole point. So the metrics have to be related to the objectives. And the objective that I've been focused on is designing policy at both the macro level and the micro level, and implementing policies at the micro and macro level. So I'll give you some examples. Much of the reforms in what in the United States are called Social Security, old age pensions, focused on transaction costs, on returns, on the efficiency of the Social Security system and its financial viability. President Bush wanted to privatize Social Security and allow individuals their own responsibility for managing their accounts. Well, in analyzing the success of that kind of a program, he didn't take into account the effects of that kind of reform on the most important part of this retirement program, which is highlighted by the name that we give in the United States to those old age retirement programs, Social Security. It's the second word, security. And privatization undermined security. So if you were talking about this as just a financial transaction, that would be one thing, but it's more than a financial transaction. The government provided old age retirement programs to enhance retirement security. And we saw what happened in the case of Chile, where they did privatize Social Security, old age retirement. And when 2008 came and the financial crisis, they lost all their security. And the result of that is people have felt a high degree of anxiety since then. Let me give you another example where the savings in the post office is again something where the British government focused originally in thinking about reforming the postal system and the efficiency, delivering mail. But in the rural areas, post offices are often a place where people connect with each other. And very rural areas, that may be the only place where they see each other. And social connectedness is a very important part of well-being. So looking at postal office as a financial institution or as an institution delivering mail is leaving out an important part of the objective of the role that they perform in our society. So the overall problem is that when we try to go from the public provision of various services to the private provision, we need to articulate and write down a clear set of metrics reflecting a set of objectives and weight those. And almost always we get it wrong. And that's the difference between that and retaining these activities within the public sector is that within the public sector, we are always reviewing our metrics. We are, or at least we should be, always listening to what we called at one point our customers, our citizens, to see if we've forgotten something. So we are constantly discussing the multiplicity of objectives, rebalancing those. The objectives may change, the role that they play of any program may change over time. And constantly asking, have we forgotten something? Have we put too much weight or too little weight on something? There's this process of constant revision. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to do that within contracts. That is the nature, you might say, of the social contract that we have with government. And governments have their problems. Electoral processes have their problems, especially in a country like the United States, where one of the two parties doesn't believe in democracy. So I don't want to pretend that this process is easy, and I don't want to be Pollyannish about it. But at least I want to emphasize a balance, that there are certain advantages in those countries where democracy is working. In those countries where democracy is working, the process of evaluation involves a constant review, reevaluation, rebalancing of metrics. Of course, metrics are important, as imperfect and incomplete as they may be, in the public sector in guiding the design of programs, as I've emphasized, but also in enabling decentralization. And that was a key part of Scotland's involvement in our agenda in the measurement of well-being and going beyond GDP. Even though Scotland is, might say a small part of the United Kingdom, 5 million people, even that has to be decentralized. And as you decentralize, you want to be able to evaluate how the decentralized units are doing and how are they doing in terms of things you care about, in things that society cares about, in terms of the objectives of the program. And that's why this broader, that was an important part in Scotland of this broader agenda of going beyond GP and assessing, measuring what counts. This kind of evaluation, I think, is especially important when we try to change direction. When we know where we're going, we're fine-tuning around the edges. But quite often we discover that the direction of our programs has been misguided. There have been groups that have been excluded. And we're very sensitive right now to that in the United States, where we've had a long history of racial discrimination, gender discrimination, ethnic discrimination, and a long history, even public programs like public housing, the New Deal programs excluded African Americans. Of course, you could say it shouldn't have occurred, but it happens. And metrics can guide us to assess the extent to which we've rectified the problems. And there needs to be this kind of constant feedback. Have we captured in our metrics what really matters? Are our metrics really good measures of success? Are they a good measure of the progress in what matters? And that's why what is going on, for instance, in the countries that have joined the Wellbeing Alliance, countries like New Zealand, I hope we'll hear from that more directly, of trying to bring in well-being into both the design of the programs, but also into the budgeting process at the macroeconomic level. The fact that the finance minister buys into this agenda of going beyond GDP, this agenda of well-being, of focusing, say, on deprivations of children as an important element that have been left out of programs, and seeing how well are we doing in reducing childhood deprivations. Having that at the macro level of making decisions about the allocation of money, and at the micro level, evaluating how well each individual program, that is very important to have this kind of congruence between the macro and the micro. And so what we need to do at the micro level is to assess, are we moving in the right direction? But even if we are moving in the right direction, we need to know, are we moving in a scalable way? Will it show up at the macro level? And that also raises the question, since in the end, our goal is societal change and the well-being of society, are there better ways of achieving our macro goals? Are there other kinds of micro interventions that would be better and better enable us to achieve those macroeconomic goals? So I've been, let me just conclude, I've been enormously pleased that over the last more than a decade, this agenda of going beyond GDP has been so successful. It has changed a lot of the dialogue of the way we debate, discuss. It has broadened the agenda. It has helped, I think, in some aspects of promoting democracy. We've had meetings in countries, say in Africa, where we had discussions with civil society and government of what are the things that ought to be included in the dashboard. What are the 5 or 6 or 10 things that programs ought to be focused on? And then thinking about, having made that kind of macro decision, how can we devolve that into microeconomic programs, into programs, and make sure that those programs are consistent with our broader societal objectives. So let me, with that, stop and look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. This was quite a provocation. So I'm sure in our audience, the statement, what you measure affects what you do, resonated among all of us. And the impossibility of putting social ambition in a contract probably stirred up a lot of emotion in some of us. So we'll have a great conversation. I wonder if we can take maybe one question from the chat, Andrea.
Yeah, so lots of discussions on the Zoom chat. Thanks, everyone. For a few comments, Louis is in the room with us, actually. Would you like to ask your question? So the reactions to it already on the chat.
Sure, thank you. So my question was related to some of the dichotomies you were drawing between the public sector and the private sector, or the for-profit providers and the non-profit providers. And I guess I was curious to know, shouldn't the ambition be to move beyond those dichotomies, to ask instead, what skills, capabilities, capacities do different actors have? And how do we come together to develop partnerships that genuinely harness those strengths in the interests of vulnerable populations?
Well, what I emphasize is that we actually need a wide range of institutional arrangements. I talked about cooperatives, NGOs, and that the structure of institutions does affect their behavior. If you have a for-profit institution, it's going to focus on making profits. And we can try to change those profit institutions at the edge by insisting they look at ESG or looking at a broader range. There are some attempts at what they call B corporations, looking beyond it. But almost inherently, for-profit institutions are focusing on profits. And that's their strength, but it's also their weaknesses. And unfortunately, a lot of the partnerships that we've had, say, between government and the private sector are the kinds of things where the outcomes are what you would have expected. The private sector takes the profits and the government takes the risk. So it's a partnership, but it's a partnership which does not work well. And that has to do, again, with some of the complexity of contracting that I hinted at, but I didn't have a chance to talk about. The private sector has limited liability, and it knows it. The public sector, much more difficult to limit its liability. So you have a design of the private sector that when things go well, they walk off with the profits. And when things go badly, they go bankrupt and they default. And so this history of PPP has not been a very good history. It has not worked very well. These are almost inherent problems. Now, I think partnerships are often important because bringing together institutions which have differing strengths can often lead to behaviors that are more successful than any one of them when you can get the right kind of cooperation. So in Bangladesh, it turned out that the government had to turn to BRAC and Grameen to do a lot of the education. They turned to an NGO. That was a particular situation in Bangladesh. But I think in some cases, government can work as a partner, especially with the NGO sector, with cooperatives. I think there's an inherent tension with for-profit institutions, but if one is aware of that inherent tension, one may be able to manage it better than we've often managed it in the past.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. I think we need to move on, but there will be time for Q&A after the panel discussion. I'm aware that Professor Beata, who is joining us as a panelist, needs to leave at 2:30, so I'd rather move us along. So thank you so much for this provocative statement and to stimulate our thinking and pushing the community to think really, really hard on how can we measure and can you design partnership, and with whom does it make sense to design partnership to tackle problems. So I would like to move us in our panel discussion. We have three panelists joining us today. They can be spotlighted for us. We have Rodney Scott, who is Associate Professor in Public Management at the University of South Wales, and he's also the Chief Policy Advisor on the Te Kawa Matao Public Service Commission in New Zealand. I hope I pronounced it correctly, Rodney. Thank you for joining us in the middle of the night from New Zealand. We have Beata Javorcik, who is the Chief Economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and she's also a professor here at the University of Oxford. And we have Avnish Gungandurdos, who is the managing partner and co-founder of Instiglio, which is a non-for-profit advisory organization that is focusing on poverty alleviation. So welcome all of you to this session. The way we are organizing the discussion, I'm asking our panelists to give us an opening statement as a response to what they've heard from Professor Stiglitz. They will have about 5 minutes each. I will pause for some quick Q&A if we have time, and then we will cover 3 main topics. The first topic is I would like our panelists to talk about what we want to measure, which metrics in their experience have been successful or difficult, the link between macro metrics, GDP, inequality, sustainability, and the micro level of programs and making a difference on the ground, and maybe some recommendation on how we can tackle the challenge ahead of us in recovering from the pandemic. So, Rodney, can I come to you first? Can you talk a little bit about the experience of New Zealand as a reaction, Professor Stiglitz?
Thank you, Ara. Thanks for the opportunity to contribute to the discussion. I've been lucky to do a visiting fellowship at the Blavatnik School several years ago and been following the excellent work of the Government Outcomes Labs for some time. So it's a real honour to be here, and in particular, it's an honour to share the stage with Professor Stiglitz, whose work has been tremendously influential in the development of wellbeing measurement in New Zealand, and in particular through the 2 reports that he mentioned, the one for the French government and also for the OECD. So as Mara mentioned, my name is Rodney Scott. I'm from the University of New South Wales in Australia. I've also worked within the New Zealand Public Service as a policy director and as an embedded researcher for many years. In sharing a little bit about New Zealand's experience with wellbeing measures, I think it's important to frame the wellbeing budget as being the latest step in a very long process, and also very much still a work in progress that's still evolving. So I'd like to start with a brief recap of some of that recent history, because I think New Zealand's a really interesting case study in the implementation of wellbeing measures. In 2001, the Ministry of Social Development released something called the Social Report, which was really set New Zealand down the path of the capability approach to wellbeing measurement. influenced by Amartya Sen and particularly Martha Nussbaum, and you can see that in the selection of the capabilities that are reported. One of the main contributors to that social report was someone by the name of Connell Smith, who then went to the OECD and worked on the framework for measuring wellbeing and progress that was published in 2009. And then this was re-imported to New Zealand, as New Zealand often does, because it doesn't trust something until another country has told them that it's all right, as the New Zealand Living Standards Framework, which was developed between 2009 and 2012 and is the analytical engine of the wellbeing budget. You can't really understand the wellbeing budget without understanding the Living Standards Framework. So it's a framework that's attracted some international interest because it attempts to address several of the components that we identified in the Commission on Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, the report that Professor Stiglitz mentioned that was done for the French government. It has 4 elements to the framework. It's got stocks or capitals, it's got flows, distributions, and resilience. The 4 capitals, natural capital, human capital, social capital, and financial and physical capital, describe assets that generate well-being now and into the future. So there's a temporal element to the way that people think about assets. Originally, there were 5 flows that were identified through a largely theoretical or analytical exercise, but since then there's been a much more inclusive and democratic process, and the number has ballooned out to 12. And I'd be interested to hear from the rest of the panel whether this kind of trend towards increasing complexity and comprehensiveness is inherent to the process of setting a dashboard. Those are civic engagement, cultural identity, environment, health, housing, income and consumption, jobs and earning, knowledge and skills, time use, safety and security, social connections. And the 12th one's a bit of an outlier or categorically different, and that's subjective well-being, that maybe we'll get a chance to delve into more in the questions. Then there's 3 distributions. So there's among people and between population groups, across physical space and geography, and over time. And the construct that's used within New Zealand is intergenerational well-being. And the 4th element is resilience, and that's the extent to which those capitals are protected against or unable to cope with change, shocks, and unexpected events. Something that's obviously become more front of mind since the onset of the pandemic. The work in this area so far has mostly looked at resilience at a societal level or an aggregate level, but something that's being discussed more and more is resilience at an individual level, based on actually some of the work that Professor Stiglitz led in the OECD, looking at economic insecurity and vulnerabilities. So how it's been applied, since 2019, the New Zealand government has run a process called the wellbeing budget. And this has changed the way that budget bids work. So a budget bid is when a department prepares on behalf of a minister an application to receive more funding through a budget process, and this is a competitive process that's run every year. The budget bid process was changed so that now departments are required to express value for money in terms of the Living Standards Framework. So rather than simply reporting an ROI in dollar equivalent terms, departments now are required to describe the proposed investment in terms of the effects on the flows, the capitals, the distributions, and the resilience. These values are then, well, value estimates are then aggregated in the budget strategy document, although that process of aggregation has had some challenges. The next change was that the Public Finance Act was changed in 2020, and that requires now that the government sets wellbeing objectives and then explains how each of the investments in the budget contribute to those objectives. So this requires the government to describe, at least in a qualitative sense, what it's trying to do, and hopes to avoid the situation that George Fredrickson would have described as painting bullseyes around bullet holes, where the government can claim that the achieved result is what it intended all along. So I'd be interested to hear from the panel or hear more of a discussion about is the merits of using a dashboard approach, not just for describing the current state of a nation, but also for setting objectives or goals. And then the latest change has been the introduction of something called He Ara Waiora, which translates roughly as a path to wellbeing. New Zealand's a bicultural partnership between the Crown and the Indigenous Māori people. the government recognised that even though it run a very inclusive process, that the Living Standards Framework is developed from a Western European worldview. And so a second value framework was constructed from a Te Ao Māori perspective, and that's called Te Ara Waiora. And budget analysis and budget bids can be framed either in terms of benefits of Living Standards Framework or benefits in terms of Te Ara Waiora. So it's another question where I'd be interested in discussion as to whether or not the panel thinks that dashboards are universal or whether they're culturally bound. And if they're culturally bound, how can a country contend with and take account of multiple cultures that might be present within the country? There's enormous challenges to each of these developments that I suspect will come up in the discussion a bit. In general, I describe the current state of practice in New Zealand as being less adept or less experienced at doing something that's a potentially more valuable type of measurement. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodney. We will come back maybe to Professor Stiglitz to pick up on the personalization of dashboard at the end of this conversation. Beata, can I come to you next? Can you tell us, like, what is your reaction to this provocation from the perspective of your organization? What resonated?
So thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be joining this discussion. So let me bring the EBRD perspective and the challenges we are facing in our daily activities. So as a starting point, let me take one of the key messages from Professor Stiglitz's speech, namely, be clear about your objectives, right? And then once you have your objectives, measure them. So let's take a step back and think about objectives of various institutions. In the case of the World Bank, it's fairly straightforward. The first objective is to end extreme poverty. We roughly know how to capture, how to measure poverty, so that's easy. If you think about UK's CDC, until very recently, their objective was job creation. That's also fairly easy to capture. We know how to count jobs. Of course, attribution is a much bigger issue, but at least the objective is clearly defined. Now, think about the EBRD, and that's where things get much more complicated, because our objective, as stated in our articles of establishment, is to foster the transition towards open market-oriented economies and to promote private and entrepreneurial initiative. Now, in the early 1990s, that was still fairly straightforward to define. We could easily measure the progress in the former communist countries. We could simply look at the private share in the GDP, private sector share of the GDP. That was an obvious yardstick to use. However, as the time progressed, our countries of operation also made progress in this transition towards market economies. Our activities expanded to countries that do not share central planning legacy. So this objective became less relevant. And then, as we've heard in the keynote, after the global financial crisis, thinking in the economics profession and in the public sector has changed. And we realized that markets are not an answer to everything. So we redefined our objective. We are still in the business of systemic change, but now we define our objective in terms of 6 desirable qualities of economies. So 6 desirable qualities of the endpoint, or where we want the transition to end. We call them transition qualities. And they will actually echo what we have just heard from the New Zealand experience. So we want our economies to be competitive, to be inclusive, well-governed, green, resilient, and integrated. And we actually take these transition qualities very seriously. So when it comes to choosing our projects, we use 3 criteria. First, a project needs to be based on sound banking. We need our money back. A project needs to be additional. we want to say that the project would not have happened without our participation. And most importantly, we want each project to have a transition impact, at least in 2 of these areas I defined. And we actually have a fairly complex scoring system that allows us to evaluate projects in terms of this transition progress. I was part of the Besley Commission, which helped EBRD redefine its impact in terms of these transition qualities. That was in 2015. And when I came back in my current role, I was actually amazed how these 6 transition qualities became not just a disciplining device internally, but also an internal language. I almost felt that I've joined a cult, not a multilateral development institution. But of course, these transition qualities are beautiful. The problem is how to assess our impact at the aggregate level. So what we can do is we can assess so-called transition gaps, how far our countries are from the desirable point in terms of these 6 dimensions. But again, it is not straightforward because there isn't a single way of measuring a transition gap. So think about green transition quality. Of course, mitigation of climate change is here a central area, a central topic, overriding concern. But what is the right yardstick, right? You could think about how far a country is from achieving net zero emissions. Or perhaps we should be thinking about how much progress it has made relative to its Paris Agreement commitment, the so-called nationally determined contributions. Here, the trouble is that many of our countries are not particularly ambitious in their commitments. Or perhaps we should be looking at greenhouse gas emissions per unit of GDP. And depending which yardstick you use, you will get a different answer. Now, this was just an illustration. We use a range of indicators in order to avoid value judgments, but we summarize them in terms of these transition gaps. But here, the challenge is that nobody in the outside world understands this language. It's very hard to communicate this to the outside world. So let me stop here, and perhaps I will come back to the issue of communications later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Beata. That's a very challenging mission to measure. So really interesting to learn about your journey. Can we come to Avnish? What is your overarching reaction to the provocation of Professor Stiglitz? Avnish?
Thank you, Mara, and thank you for inviting me to this conversation. It's been a pleasure to hear Professor Stiglitz and Beata and Rodney as well. So just to maybe set the stage give some background on what we do. The challenge that we tackle at Instiglio is that governments already spend billions of dollars, across the world in programs that aim to improve citizens' outcomes. Think of health, education, employment services, and you name it. But this spending often fails to translate into expected improvements in outcomes. And a big part of this is due to, I think, a pervasive delivery failure when it comes to social outcomes. So we at Instiglio are we really exist to transform delivery performance and to help governments translate that public spending in outcomes that matter for citizens. And for our we do that for results-based financing. And for our results-based financing practice, we've been running close to 40 experiments in the last decade to support governments in espousing an outcomes mindset and evolving their financing and delivery management practices to manage to outcomes within their programs. That involves clarifying outcomes, specifying targets, conditioning disbursements on these targets being achieved. So I want to share, and in many ways, these are micro experiments of the wellbeing dashboard, right, at the micro level, at the program level. So some interesting parallels to what Professor Stiglitz was talking about, and I want to share 2 observations. So first, we've really seen firsthand how a lack of clear macro outcomes framework affects government's ability to deliver social outcomes at the micro level. So when you don't have clear direction at the macro level, In our micro experiments, civil servants are always each time having to engage in a costly exercise of debating and agreeing on outcomes. Sometimes it's not clear how this is connecting to a ministry's overarching mission. They debate what indicators to use. They have to design new indicators and what targets to aim for. So this is not only costly, but sometimes results in incoherence even within the same government department. In addition to that, we see that there are usually inadequate or no systems to routinely track and measure outcomes. So we have to create and invest in expensive one-off systems each time. So this makes it extremely hard to expand and scale outcomes-based approaches under these conditions. So I truly believe that working on a macro level, societal dashboard is a necessary condition for steering the civil service and its delivery system to routinely deliver outcomes. Now, the second point I wanted to make is that while a societal dashboard or well-being dashboard is a necessary condition for an outcomes-oriented government, what we observe is that it's probably not sufficient. While we've all heard that what gets measured gets done, in my experience in the public sector, what gets measured gets done if you're accountable to it. So let me give you an example of that. We have been measuring educational outcomes for decades, but it doesn't mean that our public educational systems have meaningfully and significantly improved. On the other hand, in the experiments that we have run, where we have used results-based financing to establish accountability around outcomes measures by conditioning funding to pre-agreed and measured outcomes, we see a complete transformation of the quality of service delivery, that it puts citizens, even the most vulnerable one, at the center of its decisions and actions. So, and that can result in amazing improvements in outcomes. In one example, in a results-based finance program in India, we were able to rigorously measure an improvement in the cost effectiveness of a program in delivering literacy to children in primary schools by 60% over just 3 years. In another example in Rwanda, World Bank researchers demonstrated that combining measurement and accountability delivered 30 to 80% more maternal and child outcomes in a health program compared to just measuring. So I think a discussion around shifting the societal dashboard would really benefit from being paired with a discussion around how we're going to hold our governments and markets accountable to what counts and to those dashboards and how that's going to concretely happen. If we're able to pair a societal dashboard with strong accountability to that dashboard, then I think we do have a transformational journey. Otherwise, I worry that the idea of a well-being dashboard, and there's been many versions of well-being indices. You can think of the gross national happiness index of Bhutan that's currently being measured in 130 countries around the world, will just be a measure. It's not going to necessarily translate into actual differential policy behavior and government behavior at the end of the day that do change these outcomes. Thank you, Myra.
Thank you, Avnish. I'd like to pause. There are some questions directly for other panelists and to you, Professor Stiglitz, but I wonder if we can pick a question from the audience.
Shall we go to our online audience first? So I noticed a really interesting question about how do we get better cost and well-being measures beyond GDP when we have no grid pricing mechanisms? And I know this will resonate with a lot of our stakeholders that we work with at the Government Outcomes Lab. But David, who's asked that question, I wonder if we could ask him to unmute himself and maybe put a little bit more context to his question. David, are you there? We might just need 1 second to unmute you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm here now.
Oh, great. We can hear you.
Fabulous. Thanks very much. So I'll give a bit of background to the question, which will hopefully give it a little bit of color. So it's in the chat for people who want to follow, but the background is really that outcomes partnerships, so far as I understand them, have a great potential to be able to transfer the outcome delivery risks to the private sector in return for access to capital, which is fantastic. And the profits is in some ways a return for accepting that risk. The difficulty, it seems, is both determining and then costing outcomes sufficiently well to justify the private investment from the private sector side, and then also the expenditure from the public or perhaps the philanthropic side. The third element is the delivery partner who actually delivers this. And ideally, I think delivery partners from the social sector side, so that the partnership then becomes between these three different sectors. public or philanthropic sectors setting outcomes and paying for results, the private sector who do the upfront outcome financing with payment upon results, and then the social sector which delivers those outcomes. And so that my question arises from outcomes contracts being dependent on being able to cost the outcomes well. And I guess I would like to hear from Professor Stiglitz any ideas or suggestions around how we get better at costing well-being metrics, those kind of metrics beyond GDP, when we have very few agreed pricing mechanisms in those areas. So, and yet these contracts, if we're going to push into that in that direction, need to have those pricing mechanisms.
Thank you, David.
Can you hear us, Professor Stiglitz?
Oh yeah, I can't. I hear. Did you just ask a question?
Yes, there is a question about improving. Like, in order to use well-being metrics, we need to identify how much it costs to produce this well-being, if we want to engage with various players. But it's very, very difficult. So how do we cost the production of well-being? Is it necessary? Is it possible? Do you have suggestions?
Yeah, let me comment on the previous remarks though about incentivizing. Moving from just measuring to incentivizing and making sure that the metrics get directly reflected in behavior. What I want to emphasize is that when we say incentivizing, too often we mean financially incentivizing. And I think in many areas of public concern, that's the wrong way to go. Let me give you a couple of examples. That in the United States, there's been a lot of discussion about rewarding teachers for better performance. The problem is many problems of doing it, but ascertaining what the value added. If a teacher gets lucky and has a lot of bright students, the outcomes will be higher. And if he has weak students, the outcome will be poorer. And so how do you know what the teacher's value added is? And that's extraordinarily difficult, a difficult econometric statistical problem. What we know is that we can get a lot better outcomes out of social motivation, out of professionalization, of respect for teachers. When we tell a teachers who believe they're professionals that we don't trust you, we think you're going to be lazy unless we incentivize you and give you more pay for getting better outcomes, we are demeaning teachers. We don't tell a heart surgeon, if I survive the heart surgery, I'll pay you. And if I don't, I won't pay you. None of us pays our heart surgeons in terms of performance. We believe that there's a professional ethic that says if you're a heart surgeon, you'll do everything you can to do the heart surgery well. And that's part of the individual's identity. Now, we want to know, it's important to know what does well mean. It's more than surviving the operation. It's living for 5 years, having an active life. So we want to have ways of assessing how well was that surgery? Does it really work? Did a guy really survive? Was he able to return to active life? So that's where metrics become important. It's not just survival. But I think that the attempt to reduce everything to monetize incentives is a very big mistake and demeans public service and is counterproductive. And I can give you many, many examples where public bodies have taken the opposite approach of respecting public servants, and from Medellin in Colombia to Massachusetts in the United States, and gotten much better outcomes than pay for performance. So I think metrics are important, even in this world of professional, because you help people think about what it is they should be doing and moving. Moving our organizations into the right direction. But I think excessive focus on financial returns in many, many areas is counterproductive. Now, that should give you a little bit of a flavor of my view about the notion of costing well-being. It's if go to New Zealand, where a large number of children, especially Maori, are living with deprivations, health and nutritional deprivations, educational deprivations. The issue here is a fundamental aspect of our society, the nature of the New Zealand society. And it's a primary objective of government to try to reduce those deprivations. So I think it's important to measure the extent to which those deprivations are being reduced. I don't know how we cost it. In the end, it seems to me this is one of those things that when your society makes a commitment to do something, we want to measure how successful we're doing, but it should be a first order priority. I mean, let me put it like this. We don't know how to value the benefits that we got out of the 20 years we spent in Afghanistan in the war, or the time we spent in Iraq. We ought to look at the cost. We ought to assess in one way all the benefits, but we should be very clear that there is no way that our society would have approached this in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. But where we went wrong there is we didn't take a broader view of what the true costs were, and we didn't have a broad range of assessments of the kinds of outcomes that we ought to be looking at, including the social outcomes in Afghanistan. And so that failure is not so much related to the detailed micro costing, but more to we really didn't have a framework for thinking about the key elements of what was at stake.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. And I think, David, this answers your question in an interesting way. I'll pick up on what you're just saying, Professor Stiglitz, referring to New Zealand as an example of trying to define what are the outcomes that we're interested in. So defining what good looks like rather than attaching a monetary cost, like being clear about what are the objectives. So I'll come to you, Rodney. Can you tell us briefly something more about, in practice, how does this dashboard informs decision making? This picks up on some of the provocation from Avnish as well, like, oh, you measure, but then what? So do you have example from the New Zealand experience where how the dashboard has really influenced decision making?
Yeah, thanks, Mara. I've got a few examples of that, but first, if I can just pick up on and really agree with Professor Stiglitz's last point. The zeitgeist within the New Zealand reform of the public service over the past 10 years or so has been really about trying to support the spirit of service to the community that public servants already bring to their work, and shifting away from a lot of the hard incentives approaches that went in the past and were influenced by the reforms in the 80s and 90s. And we're certainly seeing performance improvements and a lot of innovation coming out of that. As far as how the dashboards result in practical improvement, it's a really interesting question, because our current approach, the well-being approach, is so complex that, and I mentioned all of the elements of the living standards frameworks, but worth remembering that they're not additive, they're multiplicative, because every stock has a distribution across time and space and people and resilience and things. You end up with an incredibly complicated dashboard. It actually doesn't lend itself to the kind of reporting that the public could engage with. Prior to the wellbeing approach, we used a different approach, which was criticized for being very narrow measures. The measures aren't very good from a technical perspective. They can be misleading, they are subject to gaming, all those sorts of things. But by setting 10 really simple measures, it's got the attention of the public, it got the imagination of the public, and that's changed behaviors of public servants as well. So as well as being motivated by making a difference, public servants are motivated by being seen to be doing good. There's some work done by several of your colleagues at the Blavatnik School, actually. Gwyn Bevan and Brenda Fasola wrote this very interesting paper on reputational effects in the UK civil service. And once the public is watching carefully and is excited about and is paying attention to a particular outcome, then public servants are paying attention to that outcome as well, and ministers for that matter, and politicians. So that was really an important component of the previous model, was that it was a public-facing and publicly engaging dashboard, not just a technical exercise for government.
Thank you, Rodney. Can I come to you, Beata, because I know you need to go soon. You have another commitment. And I want to merge the 2 points on the complexity of a measure and how it's difficult to communicate what one is trying to do. And it's not a simple metric, it's not a simple number, and there is a holistic approach. From your experience, how do you go about communicating what you are doing at EBRD? Is you can't go out with complex econometrics. What is your experience and recommendation? Should we keep it simple? Should we make it public? And
lots of great question, Mayra. So we heard a lot about the importance of focusing on macro outcomes, right? And you know, as an institution, we would like to say something about our impact at the macro level. But the first question we need to ask ourselves is the scale of our activities large enough to make a difference at the macro level? So take a large country like Turkey. Our cumulative investment there amounted to about 2% of GDP, and that's during a 6-year period. Is it really going to make a difference to country level statistics? So perhaps you may say, well, okay, think about smaller countries. That's where you should really be seeing your impact in national statistics. But then the bigger challenge is attribution, right? How do we know that we are making a difference? So take Lebanon, a country in a deep economic and political crisis. Our investments can potentially help quite a bit. But if you look at macro statistics, you are going to see a deterioration simply because the country has been going through a very deep crisis. So, of course, things would have been worse had we not been active. So what we really would like to do is to compare the current situation to this counterfactual, this unobserved counterfactual where the country would have been without our involvement. And that becomes quite tricky to capture, to come up with. So then you may say, well, perhaps we should be focusing at the project level. And we could even be doing randomized control trials at the project level. But then you need to aggregate outcomes from a variety of projects to a single indicator at the country level. So how do you aggregate CO2 emissions saved with training provided to refugee and, helping country import ambulances by through our trade facilitation program, right? We actually have a measure of aggregation. We do it by focusing on our own measures of transition impact, but the trouble is that nobody outside the institution understands this language. So I think the first message here is that, there are no easy solution. There are lots of trade-offs, but I think the most important issue is transparency, right? Be open about what it is that you are capturing. You're never going to be perfect, but at least if you are transparent and open, that's going to go a long way. Where could we go? Well, there is a lot of expectation that multilateral institutions will contribute to SDGs. But, even there, it's not trivial to show that contribution. So my personal view is that one can focus, in a sense, on three aspects. We can attribute each of our projects to a particular SDG. It's going to be imperfect. You need to focus on the primary purpose of the project. I believe one should not do double counting. It's not going to be precise, but that's going to give you a rough measure of inputs, how much money we devoted to achieving each SDG. Then you need some sort of quantitative measure of impact. We've made a lot of progress in capturing CO2 emissions that are saved through our projects, but we haven't done equally well in other dimensions. So that's certainly some work we have to do. And then finally, you want to complement these numbers and these indicators with a narrative. Tell the story of how you contribute to systemic impact in ways that are not captured by these figures. So, have you reached a critical mass of projects? Have you made progress through policy dialogue? Have you changed the framework and in this way enabled more progress? Have your projects had demonstration effects? So I think there are trade-offs. We will never get it in a perfect way, but it's important to strive and to make progress and to reassess as we've heard in the keynote speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Beat, and thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And with your reflections. Avnish, can I come back to you and ask you to elaborate a little bit more on your experience and vision around the value of having this inclusive dashboard at the micro level and at macro level to really change behaviors?
Yeah, thank you. So perhaps before doing that, I wanted to just quickly respond to Professor Stiglitz's comments on pay for performance. And by first saying that I think most people in this space would fully agree on the statement that individual worker sort of pay for performance doesn't really work and sometimes tends to crowd out the intrinsic motivation that's much more powerful in the public sector and the public service. But most of the outcomes-based financing space, I think, is more concerned about how to motivate institutions and organizations, and that's where we tend to focus incentives. So just a small clarification on that. Then, to respond to your question, I think, when it comes to institutionalizing outcomes-based approaches and actually converting an idea like a dashboard, a societal dashboard, into a real lever of change for governments, for markets, for societies at large, our own bottom sort of up approach, I must admit, has been extremely difficult, and in fact too difficult. We have had quite a few successes, but I think most of them have been driven by very unique visionaries within the public sector and by some unique and temporary conditions, if you will, right? It's not been this kind of massive institutional uptake that you'd have hoped for fairly simple, management practices that seem to make sense in most industries. And you know, despite significant efforts, I think I'm not just talking about Instiglio, I'm talking about whole community, and many of them are connected today, of actors working on outcomes-based approaches, working on promoting them in the public sector. We have to admit that this remains mostly at the margins of the industry, and we really are struggling to mainstream. And that is very concerning. Like if you have a solution, as I was describing earlier, that in many different examples has demonstrated we can actually motivate better performance through a set of simple improvements in delivery management, 10%, 30%, 40% improvement. That's a meaningful order of magnitude of performance improvement. If you had such a solution, like just imagine in the private sector, if you had a solution that could increase profits in that way, you'd be a billionaire overnight. This would scale up like really rapidly. But in the public sector, we constantly see that incredibly impactful innovations really struggle to take off. And you can think of many other examples. Think of the expansion of evidence-based policymaking. We have much more evidence today that it's being used. The adoption of technology. We have much more technology. We're so far from the technology frontier in the public sector. The integration of behavioral science and many more examples. So these are all management practices that can really catapult social and environmental outcomes, and yet they're not really taking off. So I think it's important to pause and to kind of ask ourselves, what is going on? What's the root cause analysis of this challenge? And you realize that these innovations, in my view, actually, at least don't take off because the social impact and the social value they are generating doesn't have proportional political value. And that's the case because in many societies where we work, political systems actually are serving a very small and narrow group of stakeholders and elites, who drive political outcomes, and for whom these outcomes, like inequality, environmental outcomes, do not matter that much. So it's not surprising that we face, when faced with limited resources, fairly rational political agents, would consistently underfund, underprioritize, and underdeliver outcomes. So, where does that lead us? For well-being, to a dashboard to become, I think, a durable and meaningful rudder of change in policymaking, we need to accompany it with a shift in political power. We need to talk about this. We need to find ways to align future political success of politicians and governments to these outcomes that we care about. And to do that, we're going to need to bring a broader group of stakeholders who do care about these outcomes to be meaningfully able to influence and hold governments accountable. And a good analogy of this, if you think about the feminist movement strategy with respect to women's outcomes in the workplace, I think one of its most powerful strategies was getting women in the boardroom. That immediately transformed the macro intent and interest of businesses with respect to women outcomes. Still a long way to go, but I think we're making some good progress. So the real question for us is how are we going to get different stakeholders who care about different outcomes in the government's boardroom? For instance, it would be great if governments are accountable for future generations in terms of environmental outcomes. It would be great if ministers of education were accountable to parents, but that's currently not happening. So I think that discussion is really important because, I've been seeing in the chat, people have been pointing out, JFK talked about well-being indicators 50 years ago. Bhutan launched a happiness index 20 years ago. And today we're talking still about, a well-being dashboard. We haven't made that much progress when you think of the time span that we're talking about. And I think we need to really think hard about, how to change who's holding governments accountable if we want to see different social and environmental outcomes being prioritized and truly prioritized by policymakers and markets.
Thank you. Professor Stiglitz, you want to pick up on this comment? Can we unmute the Professor Stiglitz, please, from the AV?
I'm a little bit more optimistic because I think the discussions today are broader. I think when you look at government programs, there is a more greater concern of assessing inclusiveness, impact on climate, that there is a sense in which when we have very specifically defined elements of the dashboard that represent a change from what we've done before, and that's what I mentioned in my talk. When you have, say, a group that's been excluded, you can assess whether there's success in including them in your programs. when you've forgotten about the adverse effect of programs on climate, you can measure the carbon footprint, and that directs attention to those elements. So let me just, I wanted to add one more comment about the issue of scalability, that each, even as say the World Bank, EBRD, are going to be relatively small compared to the GDP of the countries that they're operating in. And that's even true of government programs in any area is going to be small relative to GDP. But I think you need to think about, in terms of scalability, the way that programs can have a catalytic role, the way that government programs can help change the culture, the way we go about doing things, the norms of, say, inclusiveness. And that's a slow process in one sense, but the impacts can be much greater than the particular project that we're talking about. So if I were looking at a broader range of assessment, I would want to see, have they been a role model? Have they had a catalytic effect? Have they changed culture? Have they changed norms? And I think in many ways, creating the dashboard has helped change the conversation. It's only one thing. It was part of a social movement, but including in metrics of inequality, increase our focus on inequality, and has, I think, played a role, just a part of the role, in the greater attention that is being paid today on inclusiveness. And, it goes back to the SDGs. You can think of as a part of a broad metric. And there was a very big international discussion about what should be included. Many of you may have forgotten that in the debate leading up to the SDGs, the United States government and the UK government opposed including an SDG for inequality. And there was a broad international discussion. And in the end, the agreement was that inequality was an important aspect of well-being, and it has been included. And that has, I think, reinforced what was going on, which is it is an important measure. Not everybody agreed. The United States government, Obama, did not want that included, partly because he knew that we would not look very well in that. But the UK also was resistant. So I think I view this as part of the democratic dialogue where we help elevate certain topics to greater attention. And then that helps permeate that through our institutions and through a broader range of decision making.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes to go. I wonder if we can pick up a last question from the audience.
The question from Quentin Wilson about the role of engaging the community. And I know with the Go Lab, we spend a lot of time talking about making sure we include the voice of service users. So it'd be great to have reflections from Professor Stiglitz and the panelists around what this looks like in the context of measuring well-being.
How do we engage the actual the citizens and the people we want to contribute, whose well-being we want to improve? How do we engage them? Is it just a democratic process? Do we engage them more directly?
Well, I think we have to do it in every possible way. I think, democracies are more than elections every 4 years or 5 years, depending on your country, or every 2 years. It is a constant interaction which entails, I think, creating a strong civil society that helps foment that, a strong media that helps engage that kind of conversation, you might say meetings like this, our universities play an important role, that there are multiple ways in which we have this conversation going on that helps lead to a view about what we care about. And we have to remember, not everybody is going to agree exactly. And that's one of the reasons against having, that was one of the arguments for a dashboard. We can agree more on what are important elements than we can agree on the precise weights that we put on those different elements. So in many ways, the millennial development, the SDGs were an important effort of the international community to come together and list, I mean, admittedly a large number, but still there were many other goals that people wanted to include. That was a very broad conversation around the whole world. And there was a certain excitement that so many people all over the world were engaged in that kind of conversation that was about norm setting in both developed and developing countries. What are the things that we care about? And that is, in a sense, a broad dashboard. And then within each of our countries, we have that debate about which are the ones that we are going to be focusing on most. Some of the things are not, it's not that they're not important, but they're not contentious anymore. But the elements that we're focusing on are the things where we're particularly deficient, like in South Africa, really obviously concerned about jobs and employment as something that is very core. So in a sense, when you say, let's focus on these elements, it doesn't say those are the only important ones, but those are the ones where the public debate today needs to center attention on, because there are either deprivations or there are controversies or trade-offs that we have to confront.
Thank you. Avnish and Rodney, you want to have a final comment?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mara. So I think, one of the maybe final comment is, one of the important things when we're in this kind of journey of public sector transformation is just, an honest stock taking of where we are and whether we're on track. And I think the traditional way of answering that question is, the pre-post method, right? So where were we 5 years ago and where are we today? Are we meaningfully in a better place than 5 years ago when it comes to government effectiveness? And I think that's a reasonable measure if the world is progressing in a linear way, if citizens' expectations are not exponentially growing, if complexity of the issues that governments are tackling is not exponentially growing, if, the work ahead is not becoming incredibly harder. But I think we are actually in a world that's exponentially growing when you're standing in the seat of a government official, right? Let's just think of a couple of issues, Societies are facing challenges of unprecedented complexity. COVID, successfully preparing and engaging the fourth industrial revolution, the future of work, and what's going to happen to the next generations. These are issues we expect climate change. These are issues we expect governments to lead on that are incredibly more complex than issues we've had to face in the past. Public trust is at an all-time low. So I think we're not in a linear world, we're in an exponential world. And that way of measuring, looking at the past and the present and saying whether we're better off just doesn't work anymore. What we need to be asking is, where do we need to be tomorrow? And are we actually anywhere close to that? And my sentiment is that we are progressing at a failing rate. So I think it's a really dangerous place to be. And my sort of call to action is to really challenge ourselves to think much more disruptively around how we're gonna, productively challenge the political systems that consistently produce outcomes that we don't believe in anymore. And we're gonna have to work at this meso-systemic level if we want to see very different outcomes. So that's what I want to leave people with.
Thank you, Avnish. Rodney, you have a 30-second statement.
Yeah, the final thought that I wanted to bring up was just how the New Zealand COVID response, and indeed COVID responses around the world, have taught us a lot about the interaction between social outcomes and the ability of government to do work. We tend to think of it in the other direction in terms of how governments do work in order to achieve social outcomes. And the social cohesion and the levels of trust in government were, I think, the main drivers behind the success of the COVID response. And I think what that's taught us is that the relationship between social outcomes and government effectiveness is a circular relationship rather than just a one-dimensional one.
Thank you, Rodney. We came to time, so I want to thank you, Professor Stiglitz. This has been extremely provocative, and it reminded at least me that we need to focus on opening a conversation about what good looks like and measuring it as a way to shift norms and using it as incentive or whatever is the method. The goal is to really shift norms and help people to pull together toward those shared goals. So this is an ambitious journey that people at our conference are embarking on. For those who can stay online, you can network with each other for another 15 minutes. You will be assigned to a breakout session. For those of you who are here in Oxford, there will be a break. Then we can mingle outside, or you can stay in a breakout room to mingle with people online. And we will have some breakout session at 3:30 UK time. If you are online, go on the program and see what the sessions are about.
Before we say goodbye, we thank everyone in the audience as well, both at
Yes.
Oxford and online, for the incredible conversations on the chats.
Absolutely.
Bearing with us in this experiment of running a hybrid conference.
Thank you so much to our panelists.